Bien, alors on reprend le cours de la journée et on va écouter tout d'abord Lucile Pouthier qui va nous parler de la question carcérale et raciale en Afrique du Sud, donc dans une perspective transdisciplinaire. Sa communication est intitulée Transdisciplinarity approach to issues of race and incarceration in the South African context. A case against disciplinary squinting.
Okay, so I'll switch to English directly. Hi. So, as Mr. Roki said, so my topic of study is racial identities and incarceration in the Western Cape. So it's a region in South Africa. For those of you who don't really know the South African context, there were under apartheid 4 racial categories. White, black, Indians, and a racial category that's not very well known outside of South Africa, the so-called colored category, which still exists today. And the colored community, which is mainly represented in the Western Cape, the region of Cape Town, is suffering from extremely high levels of incarceration. To give you an approximate number, they stand for approximately 49% of the population in the Western Cape, but they're 67% of the prison population in the Western Cape. So you see the figures are actually quite striking. And so what I do is that I gather the life stories of inmates and former inmates to try and understand that phenomenon, the roots of the phenomenon, and also the the consequences on the community of that phenomenon. My approach is a transdisciplinary one, and today I would like to make a case against what I've called transdisciplinary squinting, or the fact of being disciplinarily cross-eyed, if you will, which is basically what you call disciplinary decadence. I chose this metaphor of squinting, being cross-eyed, because I think it best describes a tendency in academia of focusing only on one's discipline, being unable to look away from one's discipline as if it were the focal point of knowledge, basically. And the consequence of that being, of course, a vision impairment. I think that transdisciplinarity remains one of the ways to work against that. This tendency is actually, according to me, threatening the liveliness of social sciences. And in order to make my case, I would like to share with you my experience on the field. What does it mean to apply transdisciplinarity to a specific field of study in a city, in a foreign city, for a researcher? So coming as I do from the very French and undisciplined field of civilisation des pays anglophones, having to make clear my disciplinary position was part of my daily experience in the field. So first I'd like to expose my topic of study and show why a transdisciplinary approach, according to me, is the best way to tackle it. Then I will argue that it is actually an epistemological necessity as much as a political one. I would argue first that my thesis is transdisciplinary in essence. As a matter of fact, my topic of study is very wide, too wide, some would argue. And it's also because of the subject it tackles, the subject matter. It seeks to understand collective identities via the prism of individual stories. It tackles issues of crime and incarceration. It dwells on an identity whose legitimacy is being questioned today in South Africa. It has been contested on historical, cultural, and political grounds since the end of apartheid. So this topic is located at the crossroads of several disciplines: sociology, history, criminology, law, psychology. to name a few. And that's all relatively nice and unproblematic until one is confronted with the field. Indeed, in reality, transdisciplinarity is more complicated to uphold than in theory. And a very recurrent feeling I've been feeling ever since I started working on this thesis is one of discomfort. It did not fade away as I entered the field. Actually, it grew. First, I think it's because of the subject matter. The so-called, quote-unquote, so-called college community fits the description of what Lewis Gordon calls problem people. The mere fact that one uses the word so-called with air quotes to qualify it is indication in itself that it is problematic. It raises questions. I've heard someone say once so-called whites and so-called blacks, but only once. But the word is applied to colored identity, like very often. The status of that identity, the political use the apartheid regime made of it, basically they were used as a buffer between blacks and white. The fact that it still exists today as a census category, even though South Africa is trying to grapple with its racist past and present. All of this makes it a problem in itself. And of course, interviewing, again, quote-unquote criminals is loaded. In democratic societies, and in South Africa especially, I think, what Loïc Vacan calls the global security tornado crystallizes criminals as enemies of social order, which is considered to be the proper cradle of democracy. So second, I think why that discomfort grew is because of my position as a researcher, a position that can be summed up in the anecdote that I'm going to tell you now. In 2012, I was already working on the same topic, and I went to look for advice from various scholars and researchers, and I went to the University of the Western Cape, which is historically a college university, and I talked to a teacher, a professor, who told me basically that my topic was out of date. And he ended our conversation by saying, yeah, well, maybe one day we'll come and study you. And that made my position very clear to me, and it stuck with me ever since. And finally, this discomfort comes from the way, I guess, I chose to approach this topic. The heart of the study, as I said, is the testimonies of those inmates and ex-inmates. It is sociological in its method, but I don't come from the field of sociology, nor am I a history student, nor students of criminology. So when I talk to professors and other PhD students, more often than not, the questions that they would ask me after I've exposed my topic was, what do you study again? And when I told them that I study, that I'm an English major, their facial expression would change from just curiosity to incomprehension, or often downright condescension. Because it's not the fact that English studies is wrong in itself, but it's just that for people who are outside of it, studying English means that you will study linguistics and literature. So it's understandable. I mean, after all, English is a language, and a discipline is like a researcher's business card. It opens up a world of meaning for those who are trying to understand who you are and where you come from. It helps your interlocutor to locate you on their epistemological map. And it's true of everyone I spoke to, from even people who did not belong to academia, and including inmates. But as it turns out, inmates in the Western Cape, at least, are so used to being studied, being the subject matter of studies and programs that, well, they're often better acquainted with academia than people who have never been through prison, and didn't see it so much as a problem. So generally, to save time, I therefore said that I study a mix of history and sociology, which is not true, and it, according to me, doesn't mean anything, because it supposes that there is such a thing as a pure discipline that would be mixed with another one. But just as the idea of a pure race, for me, is a fable, the idea of a pure discipline is also, it's an academic fable, basically. So yeah, transdisciplinarity, lived transdisciplinarity is a little more complicated than it is in theory. But to me, this discomfort is, if anything, a good thing. It's a condition for the liveliness of social sciences. It pushes you to always reconsider your approach and your topic. And as such, it appears as an epistemological necessity for me. Maybe if researchers saw their disciplines for what they are, lenses, a specific way to relate to reality and interrogate the world, then disciplinary squinting would not be such a problem. My experience is that more often than not, professors in various disciplines treat them as self-evident facts. Few of them seem to reflect upon the fact that disciplines too are the product of specific time and place. Or even when they are conscious of it, they do not act upon it. But the risk, I would argue, is vision impairment, the impossibility to see beyond your discipline at the world you're actually studying. I would like to take the example of Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions to make my case again. Kuhn takes the case of Dalton. Dalton was a scientist who discovered the properties of atoms. What Kuhn tells us is that he approached the theory of atoms, atomic theory, through the lens of meteorological approach, and chemists who were who were busy trying to discover the properties of the atoms were very mad at Dalton for having that approach, which was not a pure one. Even though, I mean, they criticized Dalton for not being a chemist, his discovery became the dominant paradigm. So if it can be accepted that paradigm shifts and scientific revolutions can be achieved through transdisciplinarity in hard sciences, quote unquote hard sciences, why can't it be so with social sciences? Granted, the inherent differences between social sciences are in fact less thorough than we might think, and a revolution is less to be expected. However, paradigm shifts also pertain to social sciences, and I think texts like Said's Orientalism and Mudimbe's The Invention of Africa did prompt social scientists to work in a different world before and after reading them, which, according to Kuhn, is the definition of a paradigm shift. So what the example of Dalton in Kuhn's book shows us is that transdisciplinary outlook is actually a precondition of scientific discoveries and epistemological liveliness. It requires that we look beyond the discipline and at what is really at stake, making sense of reality. La réalité, notre unique recours, as Fanon would say in Peau Noire, Masque Blanc. And I guess the main difference between hard and soft, here social sciences, is that the paradigm shift in the former is more radically transformative than in the latter. Meaning that since hard sciences aim at the study of matter, concrete matter, they can't be completely disconnected from it. With social sciences, that disconnection is completely possible. We don't live in a world where the Earth is flat, but we still live in a world where people consider Africa as a country. As researchers, I believe that we have a duty to take that into account. And I doubt that actually people who are married to their discipline would disagree with me in theory. But in fact, in hard fact, what are they ready to do to make that position clear and evolve. Which is why I think transdisciplinarity is also a political necessity as much as an epistemological one. So in order to conclude, because I think, I don't have that much time left, I would just try to take just 2 examples to show what we can actually do as researchers to achieve that sort of transdisciplinarity. I belong to a group of researchers that gathers every month to tackle the issue of incarceration and freedoms and justice. It's a group, a seminar that's led by one of the French specialists of criminology called Pierre-Victor Tournier. And what I think is very interesting with this seminar is that it actually brings together not only people who are doing research on the prison world, but also people who work within the prison world, people who deal with inmates on a daily basis, social workers, psychologists, wardens, even the heads of several incarceration centers, and inmates themselves. There was one presentation that was actually made by a former inmate who did a PhD that drew from his experience as an inmate. So I think that type of approach is dynamic because it's not so much applied research as a research that tries to engage with reality, with the reality of a certain object of study. And I think that's what we're trying to do today. And I hope that's what we'll be able to achieve with YST, which is a research project that we'll be introducing later today. And then by way of conclusion, I would like to share another anecdote that shows the potential harm of disciplinary squinting. And I was lucky enough to be granted access to the Department of Correctional Services to conduct my interviews in prison. I applied for permission to interview inmates, and unlike anything that anyone had told me, it was not a nightmare. I didn't have to reapply several times. I didn't lose my application. While other people I spoke to told me that they were just not given permission, full stop. And after talking to the person who was in charge of my orientation with the Department of Correctional Services, I understood why. The main reason, I think, is because they thought my topic was non-threatening to the institution, because they thought that I'm not studying something that comes from the institution itself. Race does not come from prison, according to them. I realized also that they simply had not really understood what the research was about, because they couldn't pinpoint my location on a disciplinary chart. And as a result, I was granted access to the Department of Correctional Services, which is usually quite fearful of researchers. So I guess, again, a transdisciplinary approach here proved to be actively useful for my research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Do we have questions? Est-ce qu'il y a des questions? Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation, it was wonderful. My name is Elisa. I want to tie directly to what you were talking about. I don't know what you know about French reality strictly on migration, but I just was happening to talk to a friend in these last days, and she is doing her master, and she's from Italy. She's doing her master research on women migrants here in France, and everything that you said is very consistent with the remarks that she was making and the observations that she is doing on field, on hospitals now, for instance, where institutional structures in general that are available for these women who happen to be pregnant and totally left to themselves. And I could feel how she felt or other people that she met felt, both workers and women finding themselves in the situation, like a very solid isolation of all these subjects, ending up in a difficult way of organizing strategies to basically build mutual help and solidarity among these women, for instance. And so I think this is very relevant, like the example you bring of these meetings that you have with this other professor to be translated to whichever other reality aside to like prison reality and etc. So yeah, for the social, whatever, like social sciences in general. And what is interesting is that definitely deals with lived realities. I mean, those are the people who should be made space for their own autonomy to thrive and safety, etc. So thank you for your speech, and I thought it was very relevant. And my question, I guess, would be if you know any of these dynamics happening in France for spaces different or being aside to the prison one.
In France, you mean?
Oh yeah, in France or in South Africa or in the spaces that you know you're more familiar with.
In South Africa, I think one of the best things that's been written, for instance, on prison is a book called The Number by a person who's a journalist. His name is Johnny Steinberg. And it's the most complete and free of disciplinary squinting thing I've ever seen, because he's not bothered by disciplines. He's a journalist. He's doing his work basically is just to investigate every possible area of knowledge, to construct a narrative. And I was really inspired by that book, because he basically the whole story of the book is it's a biography. It's the biography of one inmate that tells the story of the Khalid community and one gang in particular in the Western Cape. And I was admirative, because it grapples with lived realities, and he takes basically everything he needs to understand the complexity of that man, and he doesn't refrain from any area of investigation. And that's, for me, that's the thing that I'm really aiming for. But when I introduced my topic to my then sociology teachers, they just dismissed it because they thought that it was not the way I approached it. It was not sociological. So yeah. Yes. I don't know.
Hi, I'm Louis Gordon.
Yes.
No, I loved your presentation. There are two things that come to mind that I was curious to hear from you. The first thing is you pointed out, I didn't get to present it earlier, but one problem with disciplinary decadence or disciplinary squinting, as you say, is the failure to understand that the human world is broader than a discipline. And so if the human being doesn't fit the discipline, the error is to say that must be because something's wrong with the human being, not that the methods need to be transformed, okay? And so what I find interesting is if you take the position that the disciplines need to be transformed, it means you take seriously that there are disciplines that produce problem people, okay? Now, what I find interesting is whenever I'm traveling to places, and especially when I go to parts of Africa, South Africa or Kenya, there are people who want to inform me of the social scientific readings of the communities. And they get insulted when I say I don't want to read anything. All right? And I would like to go there and learn. And it's because in the past, when I did read, when I did go to the places, almost everything I read was wrong, because they were attached to certain disciplinary tropes that they would impose on the people, and which basically makes the people disappear. Now, it's interesting, I'm raising it because I sense in your talk also an interesting position on ethnography. Because, as we know, there are ethnographers who fail to understand when they enter an ethnographic situation, they're in a unique relationship with the subjects of study. And you raised an interesting thing in your paper about what happens when you enter a situation where the subjects of study, because you don't fall within the expected paradigms, have a relationship to studying you. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
So it creates an intersubjective study. While you're studying them, they're studying you, which changes the ethnographic relationship. And I've argued in other writings that that happens. For instance, you look at me physically, there are people who would say I'm like a colored in South Africa, but they know I'm not a colored. They wonder if I'm an Indian or what. However, when you enter a room, you know how a white person is in South Africa. A white person wants to know where there are other white people. A person, regardless of color, who enters a room going to a population of what's called colored or black disrupts the sociological paradigm. Do you see what I'm getting at? So I'm asking you, as you do this, that suspension, that teleological suspension of those, what did you discover about those intersubjective relations? I sense it in the paper, but I'm curious if that led to you questioning what you are in the studying situation.
Sorry, there's one last question, maybe three. So,
Sorry for such a long.
Antoine's and Jane's questions then.
Merci pour la présentation. J'étais juste curieux, peut-être que tu l'as dit, mais je n'ai pas compris. Qu'est-ce que tu vas en fait en faire de ces interviews que j'ai menées avec les détenus? Et surtout, est-ce que c'est une des seules sources du coup que tu as utilisées pour ton étude, ou qu'est-ce que tu utilises pour les contrebalancer en quelque sorte?
And Jane Gordon's question.
Sure. There are two, and I'll be quick. The first relates to something that Louis was raising earlier, which is there's a very familiar story that's told in private about ethnography, right? Which is that people are very well trained. They go to the field, they encounter all kinds of things that their training didn't prepare them for, and then they respond. And if they respond well, they learn a great deal. If they don't, it's not such an illuminating experience. And then they return and act as if their ethnographic training was sufficient, that there was nothing for which it didn't prepare them. And so I wonder about sort of that predicament and what it suggests about this work more generally. And what I mean by that is the extent to which, out of disciplinary loyalty, we suggest that our methods are more adequate than they in fact are, or more complete than they in fact are. And out of loyalty, we engage in a fundamental lie. Mm-hmm. A story like yours is actually very helpful and challenging. Mm-hmm. And then the second question is, I'm not sure the extent to which this is true in the French Academy, but in the US, there's nobody who's more critical of identity politics and identitarianism than academics, right? I mean, to call something identity politics is to dismiss it, right? And yet what's so interesting about disciplines is people are completely identitarian about their disciplinary loyalties and identities, right? You can never meet an anthropologist who doesn't tell you within 30 seconds that they're an anthropologist. The same often goes for historians. And so it's interesting. I understand that the argument that they would make in their own defense is that the identity politics of which they're critical are sort of inborn traits, whereas disciplines are chosen and we have to be socialized into them. But I wonder if they're really exaggerating the difference of their own identity politics from that which they're criticizing, because it seems very, very similar.
Well, yeah, it could be. It's secondary socialization, basically. Yeah, it's a chosen identity, but it's, yeah, in what sense is it really different from a youngster choosing to enter a gang, for instance, which is also a secondary socialization. So, yeah. Just Antoine, pour répondre à ta question, oui, j'utilise d'autres matériaux, donc bien sûr la recherche à disposition, il y a beaucoup de choses qui ont été faites. Je m'inspire aussi beaucoup de la sociologie française autour du milieu carcéral, qui n'est pas vraiment une chose qui a été qui existe en fait en Afrique du Sud, pour beaucoup de raisons, notamment le fait que jusqu'il y a très peu de temps, en fait, la prison était un instrument d'oppression politique. Donc, voilà, les problématiques sont pas les mêmes et donc l'approche française en fait du milieu carcéral est riche en fait dans le contexte sud-africain selon moi. Et j'utilise aussi beaucoup les témoignages de personnes qui en fait vivent dans les quartiers ou les personnes qui sont des spécialistes. Donc j'ai parlé à un juge par exemple, un procureur, un artiste de hip-hop qui essaie de réfléchir sur l'identité color. Enfin voilà, je vais un peu ce genre de truc. And so to answer your question, there's one thing that I lived, I felt. As a researcher, you are a door to freedom for those guys because through you, there's of course one thing about prison in South Africa is that they're all in this idea of rehabilitation, like that prison, the experience of prison can be rewarding for an individual. That you can be reborn as a good citizen, basically through prison, which is also, I think, one thing that is a discourse that's prevalent in France. Well, basically in democracies, and I found that they were telling me stories. Not that I felt that they were telling me what I wanted to hear, but I thought that they were telling me what they wanted me to want to hear. So the story of the reformed gangster, for instance, there was one guy who once told me, like, you know, he was actually in the process of reinsertion. So he was on parole, like day parole. So he was already living outside, and he told me, yeah, yesterday this woman accused me of stealing something, and I was very angry. And you know what I did? I went and I got a gun. I got a gun and I wanted to kill her, you know, I wanted to threaten her, like to be really, so she understands that she can't do that. But then I reflected and I said, no, I should not resort to violence and I shouldn't do that. So I said, no, you know what, I'm not going to take the gun. So I put the gun away and I calmed myself down. And so what I don't know if that story is true, and basically it doesn't matter. That's not the question of whether the stories are true or not is not the issue. It's the meaning that they have, what they mean for that person. And to me, the way I interpreted it is that this person was playing this story of reinsertion, which is it's something that he's been drowned in for the past 14 years of his life. That's the way his life should go, basically. So that's basically what. Does that answer your question, or?
No, we have a lot to talk about.
Yeah. Okay.
And we have more time.
Sorry.
There's the buffet coming, you know, in an hour. And we're thank you very much.
Thank you.
We just need to move on.